Please stand for the reading of God's word. Today's reading is from 1 Samuel chapter 18. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were returning home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholathite for a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, "Let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall now be my son-in-law." And Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David in private and say, 'Behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law.'" And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David. And David said, "Does it seem to be a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, "Thus and so did David speak." Then Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, 'The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies.'" Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number, to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. You may be seated.
All right, good morning, everybody. Guys doing all right? We need to do any jumping jacks to get the blood flowing, warm up a little bit? I'm coming in early on Sunday mornings a little bit, and I'm watching. I used to think when I was in school and stuff that I enjoyed being a back row person. But I am realizing that there are some really committed back row people in this church. They come and sit right behind these open doors in the back row as opposed to having to sit up front. I'm impressed, but anyway. When I was a kid, growing up in the Susek household, we had this tradition on Christmas Eve. We'd come back from our church candlelight service, kind of get settled in at home, getting everything, prepared and ready for the next day. But just before we would go to bed, we'd turn on and we'd watch a movie together. We would watch A Christmas Carol, the old George C. Scott version, the actor. We don't all have as privileged of a childhood as Marcus gets to watch Die Hard every Christmas Eve, but yeah. So we would watch Christmas Carol with George C. Scott. He's the main actor in this, right? And it was always a good Sussex family tradition. But man, I can poignantly remember as a kid, well, there's some scary moments in that old version. That last ghost, the ghost of Christmas Future, he's one scary dude, right? And then the other really scary part for me always was in the beginning, when Scrooge is coming face to face with Jacob Marley's ghost. Right, he's just come home after his day at work, like he typically does. He's heating up his bowl of, I don't know what. He's just sitting up in his room, and then you just start to hear the thump, thump, and clanging coming up the stairway into his bedroom, right? And then all of a sudden, man, the door flings open, and then kind of moves in this picture of Jacob this figure of Jacob Marley, his old business associate, right? And he's all white and shriveled. His eyes are like peering right through you, not even making eye contact. He's got bandages all over his head, and he's got these chains, right, all around him. It's clanking and moving, and every time he moves. And you look at these chains, and you see they're made of iron cash boxes and ledgers and bills and deeds, or purses that says wrought in steel, right? He starts to talk, and he starts to tell about it's his torment now, that he is doomed to roam the earth in this endless sadness and regret. And Scrooge, in his typical Scrooge self, he really isn't too interested in being bothered by all humbug and such. And he's saying, maybe I just ate a bit of bad beef in seeing this apparition in front of me. And Marley, he stands up and he shakes his chains and he howls, right, to get Scrooge's attention. And he says, and don't you know, no easy part of my penance is to come here and to warn you, right, that you might avoid the fate that I endure. And he says to him, or would you not know, this is from the actual book, he says, the weight and the length of the strong coil that you bear yourself. It was as full and heavy as this, and long as this, even 7 years ago when he died, right? But you have labored on it since, and it has become a ponderous chain around you. I think I've mentioned a couple times right now as we're in, knee deep in the book of 1 Samuel, and we're in this, all enmeshed in the story of Saul. Right? Saul is this tragic, sad, really pathetic character, at this point in the story. But I think I've mentioned, maybe I haven't yet, but there's always a soft spot for me with Saul. And I think part of it is because there's something just eerily familiar about Saul, right? I find it a familiar feeling, right? When Saul is staring down the legions of the Philistines that are rushing at him in battle, and fear sets in, and instead of waiting on God and trusting patiently his promise, he does the unlawful thing and he offers a sacrifice in haste so that he can, get out into the battlefield. Or there's something familiar with Saul when after he defeats the Amalekites, and everybody's celebrating and happy, and all of his soldiers come around him, and I imagine them cheering, and rah, rah, and they say, and Saul, come on, Saul, what are we doing? Putting all these animals, devoting them to destruction. Come on, let's save them, let's have a big old feast, we'll sacrifice some to God, and we can enjoy the rest. And Saul, he admits that out of fear of their affirmation and their approval, he relents and says, and he does the wrong thing. And he says, yeah, sure, let's take some of this stuff and do just that. There's something familiar about that. Or even today, the jealousy and the fear and the anger that gets stirred up as Saul potentially stands to lose everything that has defined him, everything that he has worked for, everything that he's striven for over the past however many months or years, right? There's something familiar about that jealousy and that anger and that fear that stirs. Right, but then also, what you see in Saul, and this is the beauty of the character of Saul. Like Saul shows us very, very vividly how these familiar things, right, these familiar struggles that we just kind of endure in life and just assume and accept, how these things become these chains, right, that can wrap around you and cause you to miss out on the things that God might be doing, cause you to miss out on God's expressions of mercy to you, and literally drag you away from your Creator, drag you into madness. In other words, I see in Saul kind of what Jacob Marley was to Ebenezer Scrooge, right? He's this gift that comes to show you, look, this is what happens when you give in to these chains. This is what happens when you, instead of yielding to your Creator, instead of yielding to the one who claims right over the kingdom, yielding to the one who offers to you mercy, and yet instead yielding to your loves and your cravings and your fears, this is what happens. Right? Or I could say, as Mike was saying, in these Lenten weeks before Easter, we have this opportunity, as our church fathers in the past often thought it was wise to do, to take a season and be just a little bit more introspective and just take a little bit more of a look at some of the things maybe that, are not quite right in our own hearts, that are broken, these things that we struggle with and we wrestle with, the very things that Jesus came to die for, in other words, as we prepare ourselves and we lead up to, the cross and the resurrection. All right, so we have in Saul this, if we're going to take up that opportunity and do some of that introspection, we have Saul as this, not only sort of this mirror, but also this tragic demonstration of here's what happens when you don't give good heed to maybe the things that are going on in your own heart, soul, and life. And so we're going to kind of look at that a little bit today in this passage. I think today's a passage where you see those chains just getting tighter and tighter and dragging him further and further away. We're just going to kind of walk through the passage, pretty self-explanatory, pretty clear and straightforward. I just want to highlight a few things, namely that really all throughout this passage, God is up to something worth getting in on, something that excites people, something that pretty much everybody else sees as, hey, it's a good thing and we should be getting in on this, right? But two, Saul's missing out, partly because these chains he's got wrapped around him, dragging him away. And then three, not only is he missing out, but it's dragging him in deeper into madness and despair and darkness. Okay, so this is just some of the things we're going to be looking at. I want to highlight a few things from the text. Let's just kind of dive in, talk our way through, all right? So first of all, before we even get to Saul, we're kind of reintroduced to Jonathan. I like Jonathan's character in all of this. Right? Jonathan, remember, he was the one, we kind of got introduced to him a couple chapters ago when he's standing on the hillside looking down over the ravine over the other side. The Philistine garrison's over there. And, what I like about Jonathan is he seems just acutely aware of what God is doing. And, he's aware that, hey, God has made promises to us, and he has pledged himself to us, and he is for us, and he's mighty, and all this. And so, he's saying, what am I doing over here? And the Philistines are over there. So he says to his armor bearer, come on, let's go. Let's climb over them. Maybe God will deliver them into our hands. Right? And so while everyone else is hiding in rocks and caves and wherever else, they're just kind of staying out of the battle. Like Jonathan goes in there and starts routing the Philistines, and man, there's this great victory that comes to Israel that day. Jonathan seems just very aware of what God is doing. He seems very aware of his role and his purpose in all of that. And I think you see that again right here, right? We're told that he builds this bond, this friendship with David, on the heels of some of the drama from last week. And we're told that he loves him as his own soul. He builds a sort of loyalty with David. And then we get this really interesting part of the story. The really interesting part, I think it's in verse 4, where Jonathan, he makes a covenant with David. And then as part of that covenant, he takes off his robe and he hands that to David. Takes off his armor, takes off, gets his bow, his belt, his sword, hands all this stuff over to David. And think about this. This is actually really important. This is not just Jonathan being, hey, David, I like you. You're a great friend. Let me give you some stuff like friends do. Or it's not Jonathan being, just a super nice guy and literally taking the coat off of his back and giving it to him. It's Jonathan giving to David literally his royal robe, right? The robe that marked him out as the prince of the king of Israel. Right? He's giving to him the armor that was his as the son of the king, and resulting, military leadership. He's giving to him his sword, the sword of the prince. He's giving to him his bow and his belt, right? All this, right? Quite literally, it's like Jonathan is saying to David, I think, David, these belong to you, right? We kind of get the sense from later chapters that Jonathan has a pretty clear sense that, okay, God's on the scene. He's building his kingdom. He's delivering his people. He's securing his king and all of that. But it's not happening through his father. And it's not going to happen through him either. And so he recognizes that. And so he willfully takes off his royal robe, willfully takes off his royal armor, his royal sword. Jonathan, David, these belong to you. I think what I like about Jonathan, it's almost just the picture of just the simplicity of faith. Jonathan recognizes what God is doing. He knows who God is. And he says, why wouldn't I want to be a part of this? So here, take all this. Simplicity, but not no small thing, right? He's the next in line. He's the next one to inherit the palace, the kingdom, prestige of being the most important person in Israel, right? He's literally sacrificially handing all that over to David. And yet the point is, yeah, okay, but if this is what God is doing, if this is how God is on the scene, if this is what God is up to, I want to be on that, whatever about all this other stuff. So David, here you go. It's a neat picture, I think. That's almost a natural picture, I'd say. Like if you work through the passage, that's sort of this theme, like God is doing something great. And you almost expect this sort of natural, okay, what do I got to do to get in on that? Or here, why would I hold on to anything else? I went in on that. That's what you would almost expect. Unfortunately, it's not how the passage unfolds, and we'll get there. But we're introduced in verse 5, and at least in this setting, to Saul, who also is giving David stuff, giving David increased command over his military battalions. However, this time it's not necessarily because he's built this bond, affection, love, whatever, covenant with David. It's more because David is successful wherever he goes. In other words, you're not really sure. Why is he doing it? Well, he's probably doing this because David's good for business. Right? Young people, you know this, or you've maybe experienced this either with other people, maybe with yourselves. People engage in relationships for all sorts of reasons. For some, it's just because they're nice, friendly people and they love to have friends and engage in relationships. Right? For others, sometimes people engage in relationships more selfishly. Because they get something in return from being a friend to that person, or they make them feel a certain way, or they give them a certain social status, or whatever it is. You sort of get the sense for Saul, yeah, let's give him more acclaim, more military status, because he's kind of good for business. He's fighting my battles for me and doing all right. The other thing you want to just notice here from the beginning is the end of verse 5, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Right, everybody notices and sees and considers it a good thing. David is increasing in the kingdom and increasing in his roles and responsibilities. Right? So much so that you get this next scene, starting in verse 6, where as David and Saul are coming home after their dealings with the Philistines and their wild military successes, there's just sort of this air of celebration everywhere. Everybody's praising, everybody's singing, right? The women are coming out and they're singing their songs to Saul and David. Amy actually reminded me in the car yesterday, they were also dancing. They're not like us good Bible fellowship people that sing without twitching. But they're singing and they're dancing and they're grabbing their tambourines and they're making up songs and they're singing. It's just this, I just picture this great air of celebrations, confetti, streamers going everywhere. And I picture Saul, coming home with David and, he sees the party, sees everybody dancing, everything going on. He's, happy about this, getting in on it. And he hears the songs and he's starting to hum along to the songs too. And he's singing, these neat little ditties. Saul has killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands. And wait a minute. They're ascribing to me thousands and ascribing to David tens of thousands. And like right in that moment, an old love of Saul starts to fester in his heart. All right, you remember Saul, the one who, like we talked about in the Amalekites, had this love of the affirmation and the approval of his soldiers. Or Saul, who, after Samuel comes to him and says, Saul, the kingdom's being taken from you because of your sinful neglect of God's clear instructions to you. Saul almost, he doesn't even really comment on much. I say, yeah, okay, whatever. But Samuel, please come with me. And let's go pray together before the Lord so I can save face in front of the people and they will still respect me. Right? Saul has this old love of affirmation and whatever, the approval, the adoration of his people. And so, it's great when Saul slayed his thousands, but hold on a second, now they're giving more affirmation, more love, more approval to this David. Which then starts to elicit a little bit of fear in Saul. Well, if they love David this much, what's to stop them from giving him the kingdom? Which is perhaps his other big love, right? The other thing that he has worked for, fought for, built his whole life and his identity around, this kingdom, right? They're praising David, there goes my love and affirmation, and potentially there goes my kingdom, right? And so now this jealousy is turning to fear, and then it's turning to, we also see in the text, anger. And right, that chain just gets a little bit tighter. So much so that it's a stark scene, where it's like this lonely, isolated scene for Saul. Like everybody else is celebrating. Everybody else can see that God is doing this incredible thing through David, through his anointed king. And everybody's happy, everybody's dancing, everybody's singing their songs, except for Saul, who's chained up in jealousy, fear, and now anger. Which leads us into the next scene. Verse 10, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. I can't go back and spend the amount of time we did 2 weeks ago diving into the theological complexity of all that. Go back and rewind the tape if you want to see that from 2 weeks ago. Other than I'll just simply say, my whole perspective on that, I tend to lean towards thinking that, God is orchestrating this, sending these harmful spirits to Saul to humble him, while the opportunity still stands for him to receive God's mercy. Right? Saul's all caught up in these loves and these fears and jealousy and anger and all this. And the sense seems to me that God sends these harmful spirits to bring him low, to humble him, such that he would see his need for God and he would throw himself at the mercy of God while that opportunity for mercy still stands. Right? Because you remember how this goes. God sends the harmful spirit, but then right alongside that, he sends the healer, the restorer. He sends his anointed, David, who plays the harp, who plays the lyre, and that soothes him, and it calms him, and it sends the spirit away, right? And so it's like that dimension, right? Here it is, Saul, I'm humbling you. Right here is your restoration. Are you going to take it? Are you going to throw yourself at my mercy that I provide for you? Right? But now the ante is upped a bit because that anointed one also is the one who stands to take from Saul the things that he thinks he loves most dearly. Right? So now you have this real conflict where there in the room is the one who stands to take everything from Saul, and yet is the only one who can heal, soothe, and restore Saul. So what are you going to do, Saul? You're going to take this humbling? Are you going to throw yourself at the mercy of God? Or are you going to double down? I would argue it's the same challenge that's posed to every one of us all the time, right? We have been given Christ, who on the one hand, as we've sung, bids us come and die, bids us to deny ourselves, to pick up our cross, our instrument of death, and come follow him. Right, who bids us to, take off our royal robes, our vestments of entitlement, or to take off our symbols of these kingdoms that we've built for ourselves and lay them all at Jesus' feet. Which is not easy. This is hard. And yet, right, he bids us to come and die. How's it go? And find so that we might truly live, right? Because he's the only one who can heal, who can restore, who can bring real life that God intends for us. And so what do? Maybe even God humbles us. And maybe even he does like he did in all of 2020 and now in 2021, where he sends, perhaps in his own sovereignty, he sends this thing that humbles us all and reminds us of our creatureliness, of our brokenness, of our frailty, of our dustness, if we want to use a Lenten term, right? And what do we do in that humility? Do we throw ourselves at the mercy of our Creator, who alone can restore and lead us into life, or do we double down? Saul doubles down. Double downs, I don't know what it means. He grabs a spear, thrusts it at David, try to pin him to the wall, but David eludes him twice. And that chain just wraps all the more tight. Drags him away from the living God, his creator, one who offers time and time again mercy to him, and drags him deeper into madness. All right, that's really the way the rest of the story goes. It goes from jealousy to fear to anger to rage, thrusting the spear, to now just you almost envision maniacal scheming and plotting of how can I get rid of this problem, David, even if he can use his own daughters as pawns, right? Here's Merab, take Merab, right, in payment to killing the mighty Philistine, like I said. Only continue to be faithful and fighting the Lord's battles out there with the Philistines, thinking, well, if I can't get them, surely the Philistines will. And David says, who am I? To be considered a son-in-law to the kings. No, I can't do that. Okay, whatever. Saul says, maybe. But then he happens to notice that Michal, just like Jonathan, just like everybody else in Israel, is taking a liking to this guy David and building an affection and perhaps building a love and an interest and a loyalty to him. And Saul says, okay, here we go. David, I'll give you Michal, my other daughter. And David again says, well, who am I to be a son-in-law to the king? And not only that, but I'm just from a poor family. I probably can't even afford a bride price that you would be asking for the king's daughter. And Saul says, hey, no problem. I got you covered. I'll give you my wife. All I ask in return, 100 Philistine foreskins. Let's not ask why. I guess that's the thing you did back then. Maybe you had a trophy case. It hangs up everybody's foreskins. I don't know what. But so he sends them out there thinking, well, surely, send them out against the Philistine regiment, threatening to take their foreskins. Surely they'll deal with them appropriately or whatever. The only problem is there's this other theme that's running throughout the text. I think it's like 3 or 4 times. Verses 12, 14, verse 28, where you get this phrase, the Lord was with David. That's sort of this theme all throughout the passage. God is up to something. He's doing it through David. The Lord is with David. And so even as he grabs a few of his men, goes out against the Philistines, not only does he survive that ordeal, but he actually kills 200 Philistines and brings back 200 Philistine foreskins to Saul. Such to come the end of the passage, we have this interesting scene where everybody is noticing what God is doing. And everybody, it says, are highly esteeming David. Even Saul is noticing that God is with him. And what's the reaction? Verse 28. When Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, verse 29, Saul was even more afraid of David. Right? That's where it ends. Which highlights the whole part of the bigger point of this story. It's sort of what we talked about last week with David and Goliath. It really isn't a story about David and Goliath. It's really a story about Goliath and Yahweh, the God of Israel, whom Goliath has brought sacrilege, right, and charge against, right. So that's more what that story was. We talked about that last week, and this week, if you actually just read through the text, it's really not a story about David and Saul. Like if you notice in the passage, we really don't get a whole lot of what's going on in David's mind or David's world. Like we're talking about Jonathan, we don't really hear like what's David's response to, Jonathan's love and friendship and covenant and handing him all this stuff. Or we don't get anything of David's ambition or his interests or really even too much of his own specific actions other than for him to say, who am I to be receiving this stuff, right? It's really not a story yet, we're getting there, about David per se. This is more a story of a God who is on the scene, doing really cool things, delivering his people, establishing his kingdom, fighting their enemies, securing his king, what everybody has longed for, and everybody sees it, and everybody's celebrating it, except this one solitary figure who's doubling down, who's holding on, who's resisting, who's not relenting, who's not letting go of his kingdom, who's not letting go of his loves, who's being in grip all the more by his fear, his jealousy, his pride, whatever it is. This is really a story of God doing something incredible and Saul missing it because he's yielding to these chains that are dragging him further and further away. Right, and I think that's what really it's just sort of held out for us here, as we just kind of stop and reflect on it and take the story back home with us. Many similar ways we can look at this story and we can put ourselves into it in a way where we can say, yeah, in so many ways God has and is continuing to do such great things that we celebrate in song when we come together for worship. Right? We remember and we celebrate and we remind one another that God has put forth for us Jesus Christ, the true King, who just like David goes out and fights the battles, fights the enemies so that he may secure his bride. Right? That's what our King does. That's what Christ does. He goes out and he fights our battles. He fights the war against sin, which so easily ensnares and entangles us. He goes out and he fights the battle against death, which has robbed us of hope and joy. He goes out and he fights the battle against Satan and the spiritual forces of darkness, which would rail against God's people and would drag us back into darkness and despair. And he does all of this to secure for himself his beloved, us, his people, to deliver us, to restore us. He's been exalted at the right hand of the Father, thanks to God's and the Father's intentions. In his first order of business, he's pouring out his Spirit, which is applying that redemption, applying that resurrection to us, bringing to us new life, breaking apart old chains, leading us right into, again, the newness of life. He's giving us the Spirit who is empowering us with gifts, with which we can serve the kingdom, or minister to our brothers and sisters in the church family, or go out and engage in mission in the neighborhood, right? All these great ways that the Spirit is empowering us to be a part of this kingdom and part of the things that God is doing. We know God has his sights even set beyond just his people and his church, but he has his eyes on his whole creation, seeking to remove the stain and the scar of the curse and the wretchedness of sin that has wreaked its havoc throughout its creation. He has his eyes set on neighborhoods and families and individuals that he is sovereignly calling to himself, wanting to deliver and to rescue, and he's inviting us to get in on this wonderful story of redemption. Right? And so then, we have that same challenge. So what say ye? Do you recognize that? Do you see it? Do you search for it? Do you hunger for it? And do you willingly take off whatever old robes and things of your old kingdom you have so you can get in on it, or do you double down? Walter Brueggemann, in commenting on this passage, I like this quote. He says, the narrator, in his careful and discerning way, he wants us to see at least as much as Saul sees. We're invited to watch while history works its relentless way towards God's intention. History is not a blind force or an act of sheer power. He says this is a purpose at work, or there is a purpose at work that regularly astonishes us. It's a power that both disrupts but also heals. And David now is carried on the wave of that purpose, and the ones who trust the story ride atop this flow of history with David. They ride there with David every time they tell or they hear the story. The others, like Saul, either die or go mad. Right? Because here's the thing. God is doing this incredible stuff. God is on the scene, leading in these wonderful ways, resurrection life. And at the same time, there's still stuff in our own hearts. There's still old loves, fears, desires, whatever, that are still there and still vying for supremacy in our heart, still vying to captivate us, ensnare us, enslave us, and lead us down their broken pathways. I think I've mentioned several times, so much so that I'm sure Amy is getting sick of hearing it and actually just wondering, well, when are you actually going to change, from some of these things that you talk about and confess? And that's the insidiousness of these sins, is that though they're so blatantly obvious and they ensnare and they drag, yet time and time again, you keep going back to them. And I think the one that I probably confess the most is that, anytime Amy, God forbid, would come to me with a challenge or a word of loving critique and challenge me on something either that I've done or haven't done, the natural instinct of my heart is to throw up the defenses, to come to my self-preservation, help her to see the situation in a different light, to try to convince her that she's seeing it all wrong. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's a love of affirmation like Saul. How dare somebody think negatively of me and such that I have to quick to try to change their perspective? I don't know if it's a love of comfort such that I think, well, man, she's posing a challenge to me that I have to change or sacrifice in some way. And I love my comfort too much. I don't know if it's a fear, whatever it is. But whatever it is, it's got this grip on my heart such that even though it's a wonderful opportunity to express love to my wife and help her feel loved, even though I know that's the path of life and the path of self-preservation, it doesn't lead me anywhere. And I've experienced that time and time again, the fruitlessness of my self-defense measures or whatever. Yet time and time again, that's the natural instinct of my heart. Where does that come from? Why is that there? I don't know, but I know what it does. Man, I can double down like anybody. Instead of yielding to what God, might offer. Or I think of this, I think I think of like the past year, we've seen a really ugly situation, play out. Maybe you've caught some of the news in Christian, circles where, we're grieving some of the really horrible things that we found out, were going on in the life of Ravi Zacharias, right? Who's departed to be with his Savior because of the mercy and the grace of God, and yet there were just sins that were wreaking havoc in his life, apparently, and were also really doing terrible things to women in particular. And, the other really sad part about this story, long after now his death, right, is that not only was this sin gripping him, but it was gripping his organization and the people that followed him and supported him, right, such that not only did they not listen to some of the voices that were speaking up about some of the things that were not right in Ravi, but they doubled down and they became vicious in their counterattacks, in their counter lawsuits. How dare somebody bring accusation against Ravi Zacharias, right? And I imagine part of that is because, they had such great respect and love for this man, such that this can't possibly be true. But I think also what's coming to light is that for some of them, their whole lives, their whole well-being, their whole livelihood, and everything that they had, built, their whole ministry depended upon the success of this central figurehead of Ravi. And so if Ravi falls, their whole life falls too. And so you just imagine, it's coming to light where there was a fear there, and there was a love there, and there was a concern there such they wouldn't listen. Instead, they became vicious in their own counterattacks and things. Or look, I'd be amiss if I didn't point out, look, I didn't in the middle of summer, I didn't pick the book of 1 Samuel after praying about it for quite a while, for the fall, because I thought, I'm mentioning there's going to be a messy transition of power here. There's going to be eerily similar to what happens in the book of 1 Samuel. But it is what it is, right? There's something eerily similar about what's going on and what has gone on in the past couple months to what's happening in the book of 1 Samuel, right? There's something eerily similar when you have the masses of the president's followers who are smashing windows and overriding, Capitol Police and are storming the gates of the Capitol, heading towards the Senate and the House with whatever intentions going on in their mind. And the president is too in love with something to say, hey, guys, what are you doing? Back off. But instead, he throws his own vice president under the bus in the heat of the moment. Actually, what's more interesting to me, though, is not those actions, but it's more, again, like Ravi Zacharias, but more the organization. It's the people around him, right? It's the fears that grip the people around him that, hey, if our central figurehead falls, what do we got here? And so it's been interesting to watch the reactions. Okay, are we going to take note of what is patently not right here, or are we going to ride this guy to the grave or whatever? I don't want to dig too deep in that, but come on, you got to see some of these similarities. But so whether it's stuff in my own heart or whether it's, seasoned, lifelong Christians who devoted their life to ministry and to service and defense of the faith, or whether it's to the political apparatus, or what's going on in your own heart, right? Don't tell me there aren't things in your own hearts, things you love, things that just lie dormant under the scene, but man, they've got a grip there. And when they're challenged or when they're threatened, boom, they come right to the surface and they tighten up those chains and they start pulling you this way, right? Again, the challenge is for you, and I think it's a great challenge for First Sunday in Lent. You have an opportunity, why don't you take a look and just let's use this season to peer inside, to be a little introspection to see, are there loves? Are there fears? Is there pride? Is there jealousy? Is there something in there that has a grip that is unholy? Is there something in there that holds a position of honor far above Christ that I need to identify, I need to call out, and I need to throw at the mercies of the King? God is doing wonderful things. He has done wonderful things. He is doing wonderful things in your life, in this church, in the communities that he's called you. He's got an incredible mission out there that he's inviting you to be a part of. One of the most chilling parts of that whole, if you actually go read the book, the chilling parts of Jacob Marley's speech, he talks about how he has to roam the world in this sort of eternal regret. And he says at one point, at this time of year, Christmas especially, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raised them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode. Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? He was so in love with his cash boxes and his storehouses and whatever. He had no time to see what God was doing all around him. He had no desire to be a part of any of that. And God's doing great stuff. Don't miss out on it. Take the season to take a good look at what's holding me back. Right? You know, what are the things that are dragging me away from my Creator, the giver of mercy, and dragging me into unholy places? But as you do, right, always look forward. That's what Lent is for. It's to drive you forward. Look at these things. Take a hard look. You're free to do so because Good Friday is coming. Not only is Good Friday coming, but Easter's coming as well, too. So let's do that together in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.